Many historical maps of early America show the 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast, bordered by a vast, seemingly empty wilderness. In 1803, the narrative claims, the U.S. suddenly doubles in size when Jefferson buys the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. However, this transaction was a paper claim. Napoleon Bonaparte's forces barely governed this region, and France didn't actually own the soil. The U.S. government had essentially bought the exclusive right to try and take the land from the people already living there. A realistic map of 1803 looked like this: a dense mosaic of powerful indigenous nations that held the actual balance of power. The concept of the frontier was a loaded term, used to define a dividing line between European civilization and what colonists imagined to be savagery. It was an ideological boundary that existed primarily in the minds of those on the eastern side of the line. By drawing these abstract lines on a map, colonial powers were able to erase the existing political reality of the continent, creating the legal space required to later justify a massive transfer of land and resources. To understand why those lines were drawn, we have to look at the money. In the Proclamation Line of 1763, the British government tried to keep colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains to avoid costly wars with native tribes. This restriction directly threatened the investments of wealthy colonial land speculators, including George Washington. For many of the colonial elite, the American Revolution was fought to secure unfettered access to the natural resources of the interior. The prize was access to a global market. Europe and Asia had an insatiable demand for raw materials, turning the American wilderness into a theater for high-stakes international trade. The fur trade was the primary engine. Furs from beavers and other wild creatures were harvested across the continent, shipped across the Atlantic, and sold for a handsome profit to satisfy European fashion trends. Thomas Jefferson believed the only way for the United States to remain virtuous was for every man to own and work his own land. His vision of an agrarian republic required a seemingly endless supply of new territory for white farmers and their families. Jefferson got his chance when a massive slave rebellion in Haiti collapsed Napoleon's dreams of a New World empire. Desperate for cash to fund his wars in Europe, Napoleon decided to liquidate his claims in North America. Jefferson bought the rights to 828,000 square miles for roughly 3 cents an acre. This purchase was the financial bedrock of the young nation. The federal government would fund itself for years to come through the sale of these lands to settlers. Westward expansion functioned as a state-sponsored real estate enterprise designed to generate the capital necessary to sustain the growing United States. To protect this investment, Jefferson commissioned an expedition of surveillance. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were tasked with traversing the newly purchased lands to map out exactly what the United States now claimed. Their primary goal was to find a Northwest Passage, a direct waterway connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. This wasn't for curiosity, it was for commerce. Jefferson wanted a direct route to the markets of China, allowing American luxury goods to bypass the long journey around South America. The mission only succeeded because of the technical and diplomatic help of indigenous people. Sacagawea, an enslaved Shoshone teenager, provided the essential linguistic and cultural navigation that kept the expedition from collapsing. At the time, indigenous nations saw Lewis and Clark as just a few scruffy traders seeking alliances against rival tribes. They had no reason to believe these explorers represented a power that would eventually claim total jurisdiction over their land. The success of this reconnaissance mission locked the West into the American political imagination. It turned a paper claim into a targeted map for future conquest. Converting those paper lines into physical reality required decades of violence. Enforcing the borders meant purchasing, coercing, or conquering the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for millennia. As the borders moved west, they carried the institution of slavery with them. The newly acquired territory was quickly carved into slave-holding states to provide the labor needed for large-scale agriculture. After 1804, the involuntary migration of enslaved people dwarfs the voluntary migration of white settlers. Their labor was considered the essential engine for developing these new territories. This trade permeated every level of American society, from the tobacco fields of Virginia to the shipping hubs of New England. The entire nation functioned as a slave society, legally and economically. This created a grim paradox in Jefferson's vision. The empire of liberty he imagined for white farmers was built upon an empire of slavery for millions of African people. The frontier map is the visual record of these forced displacements and the systematic growth of the American slave trade. The early American West was a corporate and political project that built global economic supremacy by intentionally erasing the indigenous nations who owned the continent first.